Hey friends, thanks for joining me, Jim Baroud, to hear a few insights from leaders who represent our innovation ecosystem. Today's chat is with Ronan Levy, a co-founder of Field Trip and a partner at Grassfed Ventures, a venture capital and advisory firm focused on the cannabis and biotech industries.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me on. My history, trying to keep it brief, is I started my career as a lawyer, but I'm feeling much better now, as I like to say. Became an entrepreneur about 10 years ago, opened my first business in the gold industry. Business still operates, but it was never my passion to be in precious metals. So set about doing some freelance legal work, ran into a few gentlemen who were exploring a number of ideas, one of which was in the emerging medical cannabis industry in Canada. This was late 2013. They were hesitant about getting into the idea. I had gone through a number of different career paths in my life in varying industries of some degree of dubiousness. And so when I saw the opportunity in cannabis, I thought this was an incredible opportunity purely from an entrepreneurial perspective, which is very, very rarely do you see such a big industry go legal overnight, have an opportunity to participate in it. So we got involved in it purely opportunistically. We opened what became the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics in Canada, 30 locations. Helped 150,000 Canadians, maybe even more at this point, to access the legal medical cannabis system. Ultimately sold that company to a cannabis producer called Aurora Cannabis, which at the time was a very small, recently licensed producer and has grown to become one of the largest cannabis producers globally. We were their first acquisition and instrumental to the growth path that Aurora took. But notwithstanding the success we had in the cannabis industry, which was great, both financially as well as just helping to build a fascinating new industry, one of the things that struck us was we got into the cannabis industry by no means as advocates of cannabis. You know, I had tried it a handful of times, never really did anything for me. But philosophically, you know, if our clinics did nothing more than help people not go to jail for possessing cannabis, I was perfectly okay with that, because whether you think there's therapeutic potential in cannabis or not, I was fully convinced that the war on drugs was a giant boondoggle, and we shouldn't be putting people in jail for something as harmless as cannabis. What we saw, though, in our clinics is that the people we were treating were genuinely sick and they were genuinely suffering, and they had tried all of the conventional options and they were turning to cannabis by and large as a last resort, and it helped them tremendously. It was genuinely life-changing medicine for these people. And we saw it every day over and over. And it just changed my worldview about plant medicine and stigmatized medicine and these things that, you know, since a child I'd written off as dangerous or stupid or not for me. I was like, oh my God, this is real medicine that's happening here. And we're changing people's lives for the better. You know, we'd get letters all the time. People sometimes just saying like, hey, you know, the cannabis did nothing for my back pain, which is what I came in for, but I slept through the night for the first time in 7 years last night. And that has made a huge difference in my life. And we saw that over and over and over. And it really, really changed our perspective and our thinking, and really gave a lot of passion to the work we were doing. It turned it from an entrepreneurial opportunity into one that was really driven by purpose. We left Aurora after the acquisition. They acquired us in 2016. We left in 2018 because Aurora was going in a different direction and we were entrepreneurs and wanted to do something sort of new and exciting. And right around the time we left, we happened to have a chance meeting about psychedelics and what was happening in the emerging psychedelic industry. I remember having heard about Peter Thiel having made some investment in some psilocybin company, but I knew nothing more than that. But coming out of that meeting, I learned a number of things. First of all, right at that time, Michael Pollan had published the book, How to Change Your Mind. And if you haven't read How to Change Your Mind and have any interest or inclination in psychedelics or just want a good read, I'd strongly encourage you to read How to Change Your Mind. MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, a nonprofit organization in the US, had just been granted breakthrough therapy designation for a phase 2 clinical trial looking at MDMA assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD. MDMA being the primary ingredient in ecstasy. You know, they're often lumped together, but the street drugs often have other things in it. So the pure form is MDMA. But what moved me the most and opened my eyes the most was that there are about 4 or 5 online stores openly selling mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms in Canada, just openly selling them, not dark web, nothing funny about it. You could just hop on, just like you go to Amazon or any e-commerce site and buy mushrooms. And even though they were small and almost no one knew about them, what struck me was that the zeitgeist of the world had changed. The attitude had already changed, and the rest of the world was just rushing to catch up to it. And I thought, this is another incredible opportunity. And as we drilled down into the science of psychedelics, what we learned was just remarkable, and the evidence we see about the safety and efficacy of psychedelic therapies is really, truly mind-blowing. We're talking about orders of magnitude more effective and safer than current treatment options. And having just come out of the cannabis industry, having scaled a clinical network, having built the infrastructure through Aurora to support a global medical cannabis system, we realized that we had a unique opportunity and a unique skill set to help bring this new emerging psychedelic medicine industry, this psychedelic renaissance, to life. And so we hopped in, we spent a bunch of time trying to understand what the opportunities were. And about 6 months later, Field Trip was born. And lots happened since then, but I'll say the rest is history, to keep this story a little bit shorter.
That's really interesting. And just to clarify, you are in Toronto, right?
Yes, I'm based in Toronto.
You mentioned the war on drugs. So when I guess as Americans, we assume it's just America, but are you saying it was similar in Canada?
I don't think it was as ruthlessly persecuted in Canada. Canada was not sending the army into Panama or Colombia to try and shut things down. But, and I think Canada has always been a little bit more liberal-minded, a little bit more open-minded towards some of these topics than the US. But no, certainly when I went to school, we were shown all the Dare commercials. I saw the fried egg commercial. I was warned all about the dangers of drugs. So I think it was fairly similar, but in a standard Canadian way, just a little bit softer and gentler than the US executed it.
Got it. So bring us up to date. So Field Trip was born. You founded it. What's your role? How has that grown? What is it exactly? Because it looks really, pretty comprehensive. And what's your role now?
Sure. So we are in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance. There's no two ways about it. Psychedelics are going mainstream, both from a medical and cultural perspective again. And I'll save maybe my comment for it for a little bit later, but we're in the midst of it. It's still the first inning, to use a bad baseball analogy, but it's just the early days. But it's definitely happening. And so what we saw, and what's really unique about psychedelic medicine, is unlike most forms of medicine where a doctor gives you a pill and you take the pill and hopefully you feel better, psychedelic medicine is really about experiential medicine, which means the experience of the medicine is as important as the medicine itself. So you'll hear people in the psychedelic industry talk about set and setting, which means the mindset you bring into a psychedelic experience and actually the physical location where you have a psychedelic experience have an impact on the therapeutic outcomes that happen. And so as we looked around and we realized that psychedelic medicine was coming, we also saw that the infrastructure to actually deliver psychedelic medicine didn't exist. You don't want to do this in a doctor's office, right? With white walls and fluorescent lights, it's going to lead to a bad experience. And you certainly don't want to do this in a hospital setting. So when we looked about, we realized there's nowhere to actually scale psychedelic medicine to, even though it's going to become increasingly legal, increasingly approved, increasingly accessible. And so with Field Trip, what we're doing is two things. One is building the clinical infrastructure to deliver psychedelic assisted therapies at scale. Most people are unaware, but ketamine, which is a dissociative psychedelic, but also approved as an anesthetic, is perfectly legal and prescribable in Canada, the US, in fact, most places around the world. Ketamine has actually been identified by the World Health Organization as an essential medicine because it is so safe and so effective as an anesthetic that it's been deemed essential across the world. Now, at small doses, ketamine is also very psychedelic. And so over the last 10 years, there's been an increasing amount of research showing that ketamine is actually a very effective treatment for depression and other mental health conditions. So with Field Trip right now, we have clinics in Toronto, New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, Seattle, Vancouver, Fredericton, and in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. We're providing ketamine-assisted therapy for people with depression, anxiety, PTSD, any other number of mental health conditions. And we're continuing to expand because in the coming years, in about 18 months, we expect MDMA to be approved for the treatment of PTSD. And probably in about 36 to 48 months, psilocybin to be approved for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. So psychedelics as medicine are coming down the pipeway, and we're building the infrastructure to make sure that these new modalities can actually be delivered to people in need. That's through our Field Trip Health division. Through our Field Trip Discovery division, as exciting as MDMA and psilocybin and ketamine are as treatment option, it doesn't mean we can't get better. And so through Field Trip Discovery, we're developing the next generation of psychedelic medicines, drugs that are more tailored, more precise, shorter acting, less toxicity, all that kind of stuff. And so that's what Field Trip does. We're really building the infrastructure for the future of psychedelic medicine.
Wow, there's a lot there. Thank you for explaining that. So you guys are sort of the early movers, right? Essentially in this industry. Is that a safe thing to say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The analogy that we could use is if you think about the sort of advent or the mainstreaming of the internet, you needed ISPs to provide the connectivity to enable your access to the internet. In some ways, Field Trip is that. We're providing the foundational infrastructure for access to psychedelic therapies. And we're one of the first movers. We're one of 4 companies currently listed on the NASDAQ as a psychedelics company. And yeah, it's I get like early days, but lots of excitement to come.
How did you get listed on the NASDAQ? I mean, it's a small company. What was the process by which that's amazing. How did that happen?
It was a function of circumstance and opportunity. Certainly, we saw how cannabis companies had effectively used the public markets to enable scale and build the capital necessarily to build their facilities. And that's kind of where we got raised from a capital raising perspective. And so we launched in April of 2019, did a couple of small friends and family private placements. Again, through our efforts in the cannabis industry, we had made a lot of people a lot of money. And so there's a lot of people keen to invest with us again. So we did a couple of private placements. We're days away from opening our first clinic in Toronto in March of 2020. And lo and behold, something called COVID-19 swept through the world, which put our plans to open our clinic at least delayed. We ultimately opened in June. But it also threw up into uncertainty any financing plans that we had. We had been planning to do another raise in September of 2020, but with the broader markets off 40% and no one having any idea what the world would look like, we were concerned about the long-term viability just because we knew that additional capital would be needed. It just so happens that a little angel from heaven, so to speak, emerged. And even though the broader markets were off 40 or 50% at the time, there are 4 or 5 stocks that were bucking the trend. One was MindMed, one was a company now called Braxia Scientific. These tiny psychedelics companies that instead of being down were up 50%, were up 100%. And we had all sorts of investment banks calling us, asking if we wanted to raise capital. And just through life experience, we know that the windows for financing open and close. And when they're open, you should really take advantage of them. And so we thought, okay, let's take advantage, even though we weren't planning to raise money for 6 months or so. The window is now, and we don't know that the window is going to exist in 6 months. So we did a financing. The feedback from all the investors were, love the story, very excited about the prospects of Field Trip and the industry. But with the uncertainty in the markets, we need a clear path to liquidity. And in Canada, because the venture capital market isn't nearly as robust as in the US, a lot of companies go public on the Canadian Securities Exchange sooner than equivalent American companies. And so as part of that financing, we agreed to list on the Canadian Securities Exchange, which we did in October of last year, but with a clear path to ultimately uplisting to the NASDAQ. So we started the work after listing on the CSE almost immediately to uplist to the NASDAQ on the back of a financing. And so in March of last year, we raised, I think, $95 million from a number of biotech funds who liked our drug development strategy for new psychedelic medicine. And I think in July of last year, we listed on the NASDAQ, we cross-listed onto the NASDAQ. So it's it's not typical for most brick and mortar companies to follow the path that we did, but it's not atypical for drug development companies with a good strategy to access the public markets at the stage we did.
Got it. So, and this will be, as you talk through it, clearly a way for people to get into invest, but also for the big pharmas to sort of invest and also likely acquire at some point down the road, probably for billions of dollars, right?
Fingers crossed. Yes, that's the hope, at least from an investment perspective. Yeah, no, what's interesting is unlike cannabis, where pharma sat on the sideline for a long time, I think big pharma is much more actively involved in the psychedelic industry. It just fits a little bit more naturally because even though, psilocybin mushrooms are a natural product like cannabis, psilocybin and what you see in the clinical trials is actually a synthetically derived version. LSD is a synthetic, MDMA is a synthetic product. So these are all products that fit much more naturally in a pharma strategy than say cannabis. And we've already seen, Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, a big Japanese pharma manufacturer, invested $10 million in Compass Pathways, which is, leading or exploring psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. Certainly we've had interest and inquiries from big pharma into our work at Field Trip. So big pharma, I think, is going to play a much more active role in this industry than say in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so your vision is down the road, there'll be how many Field Trip facilities, across the North America? Like, let's just say end of 2024. How's that? I go almost 2 years.
Our target is to have 75 locations across North America by the end of 2024. Truthfully, I think that it's not going to even be a drop in the bucket in terms of the expected demand. One of the things we haven't touched on yet is just, I alluded to it, but it's worth enumerating the results we're seeing with psychedelic assisted therapy. So MAPS, the nonprofit looking at MDMA assisted therapy, in their first phase 3 trial, they found that after 3 MDMA assisted therapy sessions, 70%, close to 70% of participants were effectively cured of PTSD, no longer met the requirements to be considered a PTSD patient. Compare that to the current standard of care for PTSD, which seeks to achieve a 30% improvement in symptoms versus a 70% effective cure rate with no severe adverse events. You're talking orders of magnitude better option, for treatment of PTSD. With psilocybin, we're seeing clinical trials that show, now these are admittedly small academic clinical trials, but at least one clinical trial that we saw out of New York University showed that a single psilocybin-assisted therapy session can provide antidepressant effects for up to 5 years, right? Again, no adverse effects versus every day taking an SSRI or an SNRI that causes dullness and suicidal ideation and loss of libido and general unsatisfaction in life versus these very episodic, generally very pleasant experiences that provide long-term lasting benefits. It really is quite remarkable what we're seeing. And on the back of that, and when you consider that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people across the US is going to experience a clinically diagnosable, it's actually across the world, but we'll just specific to the US, will experience a clinically diagnosable instance of depression or anxiety at their lives. You start to do the math and you realize 75 clinics isn't going to even cut. It's not even going to come close to cutting what the expected demand is going to be for psychedelic assisted therapies. So 75 is our target, but I really think the demand is going to be near unlimited for the next probably 20 years, and there won't be enough infrastructure to support the expected demand.
Wow, that's dramatic. And so explain that just a little bit, Ronan, as far as an experience. So we talk about people taking pills every day, right? Typically.
Yeah.
How often would an experience or treatment be typically?
It depends on the drug that we're talking about. So looking at, let's use MDMA, for example, using that phase 3 clinical trial, that involved 3 MDMA assisted therapy sessions over the course of, I think, 2 months. So basically 3 afternoons is what that involves. And And the important thing to keep in mind is what we're talking about is psychedelic assisted therapies. So it's not like take a pill, go home, and you'll feel better in the morning, or you'll have an amazing trip and you'll feel better in the morning. This is actually paired very closely with psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, different forms of talk therapy. And it seems to be instrumental to the therapeutic outcomes, because what we see within psychedelics and the thesis behind why they seem to be so effective is there seems to be at least three things happening during a psychedelic experience. The first is most psychedelics cause your body to do a massive dump of serotonin, and that makes people feel better. It's a mood lifting hormone, and so people feel almost immediately better, whether that's ketamine, whether that's psilocybin, whether it's LSD, whether it's MDMA. People feel better usually within 45 minutes of taking the drug. So you get an immediate lift. Secondly, just like with cognitive behavioral therapy or generalized talk therapy, what happens during a psychedelic experience is people are often able to go back and revisit past experiences, past traumas, past moments in their lives with a newfound degree of objectivity. They can see it in a different light, in a different perspective. It's kind of what you're trying to get to in therapy, but instead of having taken years to get there in therapy, this happens usually on the first or second experience on a psychedelic that you get there. So you have that emotional processing that seems to happen with psychedelics. Third is with most psychedelics as well, there's a period of neuroplasticity that follows a psychedelic experience. So that kind of expresses in two ways. One is your brain actually starts to grow new neural synapses. Your brain actually is growing new brain cells, which helps parts of your brain talk to each other better. Following that, which seems when people experience depression, you actually lose neural synapses. Following a psychedelic experience, you start to grow them back. During that window, we also see people more able to adopt new habits, new perspective, new outlooks, whatever the case may be. The analogy is, and it's, the language used is probably apropos, which is people following a psychedelic experience often experience a sense of childlike wonder again. And if you think about how children are much more able than us old folks to adopt new languages, adopt new skills with a lot of facility, where it takes us a long time to do so, that's what happens. Following a psychedelic experience, your brain is much more malleable. It's much more open to adopting new habits and new perspective. And this is why the therapy becomes so important, because in the state of openness, in the state of plasticity, if you want to start eating better or meditating every day or letting go of your anger, you have much more capacity to do so than an everyday thing. And so it seems to be the combination of all these factors that lead to these amazing therapeutic outcomes that I just mentioned. And that's why when we talk about this, we're talking about psychedelic assisted therapy. If you just did the psychedelic without the therapy, then you'd have this plasticity, you'd have this great experience, but then you wouldn't turn it into concrete behavioral lifestyle change, which seems to support the benefits that we see. You would just have a good time. Your brain would feel better for a while, but inevitably you'd fall back into old patterns. And so what we're talking about is psychedelic assisted therapy. At Field Trip with ketamine, typically most people come in for 2, 4, or 6 sessions over the course of a couple of weeks. And what we're seeing is that the benefits that they show, at least in terms of depression scales and anxiety scales, can last for 4 months or longer. So we're seeing really, really remarkable results, even with ketamine. And generally speaking, ketamine shows the least amount of promise in terms of the potential of psychedelics, even though it shows incredible promise. I think the expectations around MDMA and psilocybin are even higher, but we're seeing remarkable results even just with ketamine.
And so you folks will be, since you're an early mover, you'll be a repository of data and research, right? That can sort of drive, the industry forward. Is that fair?
That's exactly right. So we're going to be seeing what's effective in terms of what patient populations are being best served, which ones are being underserved, which therapeutic protocols are most effective, how to optimize delivery of psychedelics. And yeah, we're absolutely collecting that data, and we're going to take that data and we're going to feed it into our discovery program. So if we find out, bald guys named Jim don't respond very well to psilocybin assisted therapies, then we can say like, okay, there's a population being underserved. Let's figure out what the difference is between the Jims of the world and the rest of the world, and seek to find treatments that fit that unique need. So it really is quite a powerful, virtuous cycle that we've built by having both the clinical infrastructure as well as the discovery infrastructure under one roof.
That makes a lot of sense. And so there must be competition, right? There's there's so much interest now. Who do you see as your competition, and who do you see as your sort of nascent competition down the road?
Yeah, there is competition right now, but most of the competition is focused on providing ketamine IV infusions. So ketamine, we use it as a psychedelic. We give it intramuscularly, which means you get it at a very fast onset and a very intense experience with a very small amount of drug. Because we want you to have that psychedelic experience. We want you to have that experience of revisiting past moments in your lives, kind of like the classic psychedelics. Whereas if you treat it like an IV infusion, you're treating it like an antidepressant. You're not doing the work. You're not fixing the underlying causes. You're just kind of managing the symptoms. And so most of the competition is focused on IV treatments. And so they're not really competitive. Yes, they're using ketamine, but we offer a very different product. And the results speak for themselves, which is most of our patients see benefits for up to 4 months. With most ketamine infusions, the reversion to mean is about 3 weeks, so 2 to 3 weeks. So it's a very different result. There are some other companies opening up clinical infrastructure like we are. There's a company like Revitalist who's doing similar kind of work, Psychedelic. But again, I think Field Trip is generally seen as the leader. Our reach is greater. Our brand awareness is far superior. And I think we've done a really good job of just picking up a narrative that people can believe in.
You talk about the infrastructure and therapy, right? So you're really going to need trained, you tell me, trained therapists or trained psychologists. I mean, my nephew is studying to be a psychiatrist. He's super excited about being involved with this. How do you see the human infrastructure growing to meet demand?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest challenges for this overall industry is ensuring trained therapists, because there's generally a belief that I generally subscribe to, but I have my hesitations that in order to be a truly qualified psychedelic therapist, you need to have the experience of the medicine, which is very atypical for a medical profession. You don't expect most heart surgeons to have heart surgery before they can perform heart surgery. But when it comes to psychedelics, there's genuinely a belief that in order to provide the space and the support a person needs during a psychedelic experience, you should know what they're going through. And so finding trained therapists who have experience is going to be a limiting factor. It's why we launched our own training program. Actually, we're offering ketamine assisted training to any therapists who want it, and really focus on trying to deliver the training with the experiential training. So you get a ketamine session with it in a very expedited way, because the alternatives right now are year-long courses through the California Institute of Integral Studies or certain other providers. It's a full week, twice a year kind of thing. And so that's a gating item. But I think most therapists and psychiatrists that I've met realize that psychedelics are going to be an instrumental part of the future of mental and behavioral health. So I think you'll see a lot of people start to get trained a lot more quickly than we've seen up to this point.
Got it. Of course, we could always use a lot more, right? There's not enough therapists and sociologists and psychologists as it is now, right, to meet the demand. So let's hope that just as there's been a surge in people going to nursing school and become medical doctors, let's hope that the therapists and psychologists see the same surge. So you mentioned sort of how people feel, the brains, synapses. When I've listened to people who've gone through these experiences, they talk about gratitude. Can you talk about some of the other experiences that people will go through when they do this type of experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to qualify them in any kind of objective way. Everyone's experience is going to be unique. Gratitude tends to be a common theme. What we see in a lot of the studies is that people report their psychedelic experience, their psychedelic assisted therapy experience, to be one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. They put it up there with the birth of a child, a wedding, any kind of monumental event. That's how these experiences are often received. And that's why people who have a positive experience end up becoming advocates and ambassadors for psychedelic therapies, because it becomes so meaningful for them. But it's not always, so light and airy. A good friend of mine talked about one of his experiences where he felt like he had the entire grief of the world on his shoulders. And it was positive. The actual experience was challenging, but coming through it and working through what he was feeling has become one of the most pivotal moments of his life. But during the actual experience, it wasn't so wonderful, or didn't feel so wonderful. But that's the importance of setting in therapy, actually, which is, by and large, psychedelics are quite safe. It's virtually impossible to overdose on psilocybin or LSD. Same with MDMA. They're generally non-addictive. So a lot of the things we learned in high school about these drugs was actually, if not an outright lie, a gross exaggeration. The biggest risk associated with psychedelics is that you have what's called a bad trip. The current thesis and the current belief is that there's no such thing as a bad trip per se. There are only hard trips and easy trips. An easy trip speaks for itself. A challenging trip or a hard trip can become a bad trip without the proper support. If you do it on your own, or if you're in a place where you don't feel comfortable, it can get very scary and potentially cause its own instance of trauma, that becomes memorable and very negative. But if you're with a therapist in a safe environment, they usually, and since we've opened all of our clinics, we haven't had a single negative experience or bad trip as far as I'm aware, because even those challenging experiences, the therapists help the person navigate it. And what we see is those challenging experiences are often the most cathartic. They often lead to the most transformative outcomes if you're willing to do the work, if you're properly supported. And so going back to your question, what are the other experiences? Gratitude is a common one. Love is a common one. A sense of freedom is a common one. Sometimes a lot of grief comes up. You'll hear, not so much with the legal medical psychedelics, but you'll hear with ayahuasca, people doing a lot of purging, like your body is getting rid of either pent up emotions or toxins or anything along those lines. At least that's the theory associated with it. So it really is quite variable, from very fun to very sad, from very easy to very challenging. It really depends on where you are at that time and truthfully what you need.
Got it. Well, that's really helpful, especially for, us folks who lived, when we were young, hearing just how dangerous, right? How deadly, right?
Yeah.
And just changing those perceptions. I know it's going to take time, but I think through podcasts like these and just general education, that will change over time. But it's really nice to hear.
I'm a big believer that stigma doesn't survive in the face of data. And as more and more data comes out, as we see the safety and efficacy, I think attitudes are going to change quite quickly. We already see on a cultural level, it's shifting quite rapidly. But I think the science is really going to back that up more and more, to the point where there won't be any debate about it. The stigma will be gone, because people will recognize that in a properly supervised environment, psychedelic assisted therapies are probably one of the safest medical interventions you can experience.
Right. And do you see anything, any other roadblocks like regulation or, big business, right? See this as sort of a threat to incumbents?
No, I don't think a lot of people are worried that we're going to have a repeat of the late 60s, where there's a lot of promise and excitement into the therapeutic application of psychedelics that left the lab and then created the counterculture and the backlash that led to the war on drugs in 1971, the scheduling of psychedelics. I don't think we're going to have a repeat of that. I think the world has grown up. I think the world has recognized that the war on drugs was a colossal failure. I think the internet has enabled people to access whatever they want, whenever they want. And in terms of the real risk profiles, psychedelics are never going to make it that far up. I just don't think you're going to convince the world that psychedelics are this evil that need to be addressed. We've got real problems that we need to deal with, and people having, by and large, very powerful, very therapeutic, very transformative experiences in controlled environments with psychedelics is never going to make it on the radar, nor should it, to be quite honest. But no, I don't worry about the backlash. I think about it like this, which is the U.S. has spent the last 50 years perpetrating the probably most expensive war in history, the war on drugs. And they weren't successful. I don't understand. I don't believe how anybody else expects to be able to achieve what more money, more military might, and more resources could not achieve in this. And so I'm quite confident the psychedelic renaissance will continue to bloom.
Got it. So you spoke about obviously field trip and the industry. What about you are a venture capitalist as well, so you invest in companies, particularly in these industries. So how do you see the outlook? Well, first let's go back to cannabis, right? You rode that wave. Where are we now with cannabis and sort of the outlook?
Yeah, with cannabis, I think the entire world is waiting for the U.S. federal government to get its head out of its proverbial ass and just recognize that the world has moved on and policy needs to shift, right? Enable proper banking and interstate trade. It's about time. But I think you'll see cannabis continue to grow. I think you're going to see cannabis continue to displace alcohol as one of the primary vices of choice. And I think that's net positive. If you look at the relative harms of cannabis versus alcohol, cannabis is far preferable on so many levels. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of innovation and product development. You know, a lot of people, I think rightfully so, have been taught that inhaling burnt plant matter into your lungs is probably not the best things for your lungs, even though the evidence strongly suggests that smoking cannabis has a very, very much smaller harm profile on your lungs than, say, smoking tobacco. It's still not a good idea. And so I think you're going to see a lot of product innovation, particularly in edibles and beverages, that help displace alcohol, but doesn't require a change in our social habits, right? Everyone's used to going to a bar and holding a beer or a drink or anything along those lines. And so if you can do that with a cannabis infused beverage, I think that's going to be a real game changer. And one of the biggest investments we made in the cannabis industry was into a company called Trait Biosciences, which has developed a technology that it actually enables water-soluble cannabinoids. Cannabinoids by their nature are fat-soluble. A lot of different companies use nano-emulsification techniques to try and make them mix with water. It's really just, covering up the symptoms. Eventually the water will separate like oil and vinegar, but with Trait's technology, it won't, because they've actually changed the fundamental nature of the cannabinoid in a way to make it water soluble. So that's where I would look for the future of cannabis. I mean, production is going to become commoditized, so bigger producers, not terribly meaningful. It was a few years ago, not anymore. So it's really technology, I think, at this point, and branded products that will win the day for cannabis.
Got it. Well, let's just dive into that for a second, Ronan. I had a CBD can I went to a show, and I know maybe I just don't respond to it, but I think I got a headache from it. But I'm just curious, is that the same as what you're talking about, cannabis infused?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, CBD is non-psychotropic. It doesn't affect your perception. It's not like THC or alcohol. So you probably wouldn't feel anything. If you got a headache, it was probably unrelated to the CBD. Maybe it was. I mean, some people can have, not always positive reactions to CBD, but most people experience nothing at all. That's mostly placebo effect in terms of the psychological effects of CBD. But if that was a THC drink, I promise you'd probably, depending on how much is in it, you'd definitely be feeling it. One of the challenges with beverages is, though, because of the fat soluble nature, your body metabolizes the THC pretty far down the digestive tract. So if you drink it, it's probably 45 minutes before the onset. It's one of the other things that's so promising about water soluble cannabinoids, is that your body should metabolize it much sooner, so the onset would be comparable to alcohol as well. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I think you'll see, I liken it to, I try to avoid gluten. It makes me sleepy. I'm not celiac, but I try to avoid gluten. And 5 years ago, if you bought gluten-free bread, it was pretty bad. Today, gluten-free bread is almost indecipherable from conventional bread. And so I think we're still in the first iteration of the gluten-free bread for cannabis beverages and edibles, but in a couple of years, you're going to see some really amazing products come out.
Thanks for the clarification. Just as we dive into that one more, CBD is going to be different from a THC infused? Yep. Two different things.
Yeah, so in the cannabis plant, there's been something like, I forget the number now, but north of 100 different cannabinoids. In the plant, THC and CBD being the most prevalent, but there's other ones like CBN, CBG, CBC, which haven't been studied as much. With CBD is psychoactive, means that it affects your brain chemistry, but it's non-psychotropic, so it doesn't affect your perception. THC is psychoactive and psychotropic, and anyone who's ever been high knows what that feels like. So the fact that you didn't experience much on a CBD drink is not entirely surprising, because realistically, you shouldn't feel that much after consuming a CBD drink.
Okay, got it. Thank you for clarifying. The cannabis company you mentioned earlier was Aurora, right? What was it? Someone asked that question.
Yeah, Aurora Cannabis was the company that acquired us.
Aurora Cannabis. Okay, got it. Now, what about the psychedelic? So obviously Field Trip is going to be a unicorn one of these days.
Yeah.
What else are you looking at in the psychedelic space?
Yeah, right now it's an interesting time. For me, I think that the next stage, or probably the next couple of years of psychedelic medicine, is going to focus on novel medicines. This isn't something that we saw with the cannabis industry, to draw a parallel, that it was medical cannabis for a number of years, and after medical cannabis existed, then we saw the adult use recreational market emerge. I think with psychedelics, it's going to be fairly similar, that we're going to see medical applications and novel psychedelic medicines come along. And then I think you'll see state by state jurisdictions adopt models similar to what we see in Oregon, which legalized access to psilocybin mushrooms, but only in controlled settings. And so where I think the interest is going to be in developing new medicines over the next couple of years. That's going to have the focus of capital and attention. And then I think you'll start to see different delivery mechanisms, different service providers. Going into a Nobu is different than going into a McDonald's. And then you're going to see a number of different service providers with psychedelics start to emerge in either medical or wellness kind of context. I think you'll see a lot of technology emerge to try and mimic or support psychedelic experiences, VR, AR, all that kind of stuff. You'll see a lot of music. It's all the adjunct aspects of the psychedelic experience that will start to emerge. I think that's a little bit. I think if you're investing in that area right now, it's a bit premature. But give it a year or two, when psychedelics can continue to go mainstream, and jurisdictions beyond Oregon have started to legalize access, and I think you'll see a lot more opportunities start to emerge.
So you're talking about 5 years. I mean, give us a time frame. When will things really gain traction? Let's just say go medical first, and then recreational. I know you're guesstimating.
Yeah, no. With the medical, it's barring unforeseen circumstances, you're going to see a big inflection point in 18 months. MAPS expects to complete dosing of its second phase 3 in May, have the readout results in October of next year, so October 2022. We should have all the data that the FDA needs, and then probably spring of 2023, you're going to see marketing approval, which means people will be able to go to a doctor, be prescribed MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD. That's going to be a huge inflection point. And then a couple of years later, you're going to see same for psilocybin. In the meantime, I suspect you'll see in the midterm election in the US, maybe California, Colorado, maybe even New York, although that's a bit of a long shot, move forward with ballot initiatives to at least decriminalize access to psychedelics. And in some cases, maybe even legalize in a model similar to Oregon. So I think those are the kind of biggest inflection points in the next 2 to 4 years. Well, I guess maybe not even 2 years, 1 year, I guess, is the midterm elections coming up in the US. But I think you'll see another, it's one of my favorite things coming out of the last US election was the meme going around that said, congratulations to the drugs for winning the war on drugs. And I think we're going to see that continue to perpetrate over the next year to 3 years.
Oh my God, that's a great outlook. And then besides investing in Field Trip, any general guidance on folks who want to invest in the future of psychedelics?
I haven't made any other bets in psychedelics, with the exception of one, a company called Othership that has built an app for breathwork. So you can actually induce very psychedelic-like experiences by different breathing techniques, actually. And so Othership has built an app and a platform for breathwork. And I think they know what they're doing. They've got a smart brand, and will, I think, scale quite quickly. Other than that, I'm not actually a very sophisticated pharma biotech investor. So when I look at the other companies out there, I think there's only two that I typically point to and say, if you have an opportunity to invest in them, they would, depending on valuations, it would be good. One is a company called Delix, DELIX, which has developed what seems to be a non-psychedelic psychedelic, which means it can be used more like conventional medicine. I'm a big believer that the experience is important to the therapeutic outcomes that we see in psychedelics, but that doesn't mean it's for everybody. And I think there's going to be a large number of people who are like, I don't want a psychedelic experience. I want to take a pill every day and I want to feel better. And that's perfectly fine. And Delix has a great molecule. We actually announced today that we've discovered a molecule that has a very similar profile. So it seems to be something well suited for microdosing, even though all the studies so far to date have been on large transformative doses. So that's quite exciting. And then there's a group out of the UK called Beckley Psytech, and they're just really the most likable people, very sophisticated, have a clear plan for their drug development strategies. And again, in both cases, I think you're betting on the people right now more than the technology, because the technology is still in many cases, I think, pretty early. But if there's two groups to bet on, those would be the two companies I'd bet on, besides obviously Field Trip.
Got it. And what about microdosing? You mentioned that. There's been a lot of articles, a lot of talk about microdosing. People use it obviously a lot during the pandemic. What's the general sort of feeling about the efficacy of microdosing?
There have not been a lot of studies on microdosing. In fact, the only study that's come out of some degree of rigor suggested that microdosing was no more effective than placebo, which, depending on how you look at it, is totally fine. Like if you get the benefit of microdosing, even though it's not because of the drug, you just think you feel better and therefore you feel better. Like that's wonderful in my mind, right? What a wonderful insight that our minds can actually make us feel better and we don't actually need drugs to do it. But the evidence right now around microdosing is more challenging. It's just not there, but it's also a function of it just hasn't been studied very much. And the one study that did exist wasn't fully powered. So it's hard to glean true insights from it. But I know there's a lot of hope and optimism for microdosing. Got it.
And this has been fascinating. I could talk for another hour on this, but time is short here, Ronan. Why don't we tell us, share just one thing about the future of psychedelics?
Sure. So you'll see behind me, it's a New York Times article that actually Field Trip was quite prominently featured in. And it says, psychedelics are poised to reshape psychiatry. If you read it online, I think it said, the psychedelic revolution is here. Psychiatry is never going to be the same. And so what most people accept right now, I think, at least people who are watching, is that psychedelics are going to fundamentally reshape psychiatry and behavior and mental health. What most people aren't talking about, but I would bet for a long shot, is that psychedelics are going to become the most dominant cultural and social force over the next 20 to 50 years, bar none, save maybe the existence of the metaverse. The impact that psychedelics, robust, safe, controlled access to psychedelics is going to have on the future of humanity is almost incalculable. If anyone's read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, he talks about how we went from being hunter-gatherers to villagers, right? And it was incremental steps along the way. And over the course of 4 or 5 generations, these small changes led to a fundamental shift into how humanity lived and interacted. We're on the cusp of that now. Like these subtle changes, even though people who use psychedelics don't necessarily drop out and become hippies and move into communes, if you're 1% more present in your relationship with your partner, if you're 1% more present in your relationship with your children, if you're 1% more creative, and you multiply that across 10 million people or 100 million people over the next 20 years, think about the impact that's going to have. And the best way to kind of reconcile that is think about 1969, the Woodstock generation, the counterculture. That was maybe 1 million kids getting high and partying on the LSD. And the reverberations of that 3 to 5 years are still palpably felt in our society today in so many ways. And that was 1 million kids getting high and not using this constructively. Now imagine 100 million people using this constructively as adults in a mature, thoughtful way. And it's almost impossible to imagine how the world is going to look in 20 to 50 years if this continues to roll out as I think it is. It's already hard enough to think about how the world is going to look in 20 to 50 years. But if you move a huge portion of humanity by 2% and you stack that over a couple of generations, it's really going to be huge. And I think very positive for the future of our species and the planet.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I think as I think about that, I'm in this innovation ecosystem, right? Creativity spurs innovation, spurs disruption, spurs new industries, makes our lives better, right? So
absolutely,
just the ramifications of greater creativity really portends an amazing future. So that's really great.
And that's something we haven't talked about. Like most of the studies you hear talk about mental health, depression, anxiety, but the studies also show that following psychedelic experiences, creativity is improved, empathy is improved, concern and regard for the planet is increased. There's all these wonderful pro-social side effects from psychedelic therapies that we don't talk about because there's no medical indication of lack of creativity. But as this becomes more and more mainstream and more adopted, that's going to become the conversation about, wow, this does a lot for human creativity. It does a lot for human potential. That's what's really exciting in my mind.
Wow. Yeah, no, absolutely. And if we could just, again, extend that to a more empathetic society, right? I mean, just a little bit more, that could have wonderfully positive ramifications at a very divisive time on this planet, right?
100%. 100%.
So this has been great. Ronan, why don't we close out with a poem or saying that you have?
Sure. I found a poem. I was raised Jewish and probably the worst Jew in the world, but and I hated going to synagogue, but there's always one poem that I always touched me, notwithstanding the fairly grievous nature of most synagogue services. And so it's called Life is a Journey. And it goes like this. Birth is a beginning and death a destination, and life is a journey. From childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength or from strength to weakness and often back again, from health to sickness and we pray to health again, from offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, from pain to compassion, from grief to understanding, from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until not looking backwards or ahead, we see that victory lies not at some point along the way, but in having made the journey step by step. I always get choked up reading that, so I apologize if I choked up a little bit there, but I found it super passionate, super powerful, and really meaningful about just trying to enjoy the journey, right? My favorite author, Tom Robbins, who came a close second to finding a quote, has this great expression where he says, "Give me life, all of life, the miserable as well as the superb." And I think there's a lot of insight into, like, if you can learn to enjoy even the hard parts of life, even the sad parts, even the angry parts of life, if you can learn to enjoy them, what a gift it is. And if you see that life is a journey and it's all just an experience to be experienced, it gives you a lot of scope to be able to see the world from that lens. And I think it's really powerful.
That was really thoughtful. Thank you for sharing that. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like it, leave a review, and subscribe. See you soon.